Hello, welcome to another episode of Soul Horse Sunday. And my guest today is Leah Dyck, and she is a coach and a spokesperson for the Power of Equus. So we're going to go ahead and just dive right into our conversation today. And what I'm going to do is just have you start out maybe sharing some stories with how you became spiritually involved with horses and how that journey started for you, and maybe share some examples and some of your journey with us.
Absolutely. Happy to do so. And thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be in your presence. You'll hear me maybe mention a mentor of mine, Tony Robbins, a few times throughout our conversation, because he helped me identify two of my really driving forces in life. And one of them is connection. So connecting to all living beings. So I really appreciate connecting with you and with your audience. And the second one is contribution. So being able to be of service and offer any sort of assistance that I can is a driving force for me. So just this conversation alone, if it touches anyone and helps anyone in any certain way or provides some insight or highlight for themselves, that fills a need of mine as well. So thank you for having me on.
My pleasure.
So if I was going to start with an introduction a little bit, because you've provided this sort of beautiful framework and space for us in terms of speaking about spirituality and the sacredness of connecting with horses, I would introduce myself as an energetic being first and foremost, having a human experience currently, but connected to source. And source, that connection is so individual for everyone. For some people, it's God. For some people, it's spirit, Buddha, nature, the universe. And so I honor all of that. So I'm first and foremost an energetic being. Then I'm a mother and a wife, a daughter, sister, friend, and a horsewoman. But for me, family is first, and horses are very much part of my family. So if I just kind of start a little bit with my own story, there's never been a day in my life without horses. I come from a generational horse family, and for my own first connections were through my dad and his parents. So his mother, my grandma, she lived with us for a time. So I got to know her fairly well, and she was called Barnyard Pete as a child. She's this teeny tiny little force of a woman. She had 11 children. And as a kid, she was very connected to horses specifically. She would tell me stories of the draft horses and work horses that they'd have their head down eating, and she'd scramble up their neck and they'd pick their head up and she'd slide down on their back. And just always that connection with horses. And then she married my grandfather, who I didn't ever meet in person. He passed away before I was born, but he was a horseman. And he is the avenue through which I really have access to them as well, because he spent time with my dad and taught my dad, who is also a horseman. So that's the part of spiritual connection that starts for me, because I feel my grandparents when I'm with my horses and when I'm deeply connected to them. So I feel like I actually have a type of relationship with my grandpa. I mentioned to you my maiden name is actually Junk, believe it or not. So I always think of him as Grandpa Junk. And I have that connection and feel him when I'm with the horses. And ultimately it comes through my dad. So as an infant, my dad had me up on a horse by the time I was 3 weeks old. By the time I was 4, we were riding independently. I had this lovely old Palomino mare that I'd ride in a halter and bareback. And my dad would take me on these trail rides all over. I don't even know where we went. We'd get us lost all the time. I have memories of riding along a highway and something spooked my mare and she tried to scramble up kind of the underside of a bridge, and other times getting lost in the forest. We never got lost. My dad would tell me that, but he's never gotten lost in his life. He would just take me on these long treks, 3-hour trail ride that would turn into 9. And, maybe by that time I was 8, and just some incredible experiences with my dad. So for me, spiritually, family and horses are very connected. I have memories of being a child, being so deeply connected to my horses. That's where I would choose to be first. So I come from a very big family. I'm the oldest of four. I have, I think, 32 cousins on one side and 36 on another, and we're all quite close. I do have some cousins that connected even more deeply with horses, but I would choose over anybody else to be in the barn with the cats and the dogs, but specifically with the horses. That's my childhood. And I have these memories of playing kind of follow the leader with my horses. We would set up paths and obstacles and jumps through the trees, and the horses would just follow along with us and buck and play and be so deeply connected. And I remember being enchanted with that as a child, but I didn't realize that it was maybe something that not everybody experienced. And I didn't even know at the time that not everybody had that connection or could hear them on a level. So that led me to early on knowing there was something special. I just didn't know what it was. And I grew up in a very affluent area, but we were not wealthy at all. It surprised me growing up that my very affluent friends would actually choose to spend their time at our place, and specifically with our horses. That stuck out to me. And as I was a teenager, I really started to develop this idea that I wanted to be able to share whatever it was that I knew was special about horses with people. I knew they made us feel better. I knew I could have a really bad day and go sit in the pasture with my horses and just feel better. So I started that process early. And as a teenager, I had a horse named Carlton. So he was a thoroughbred gelding that had shown kind of across Canada in the hunters and jumpers. And he'd had the startings of navicular. So my aunt and uncle actually bought him for me because, again, that wasn't something my parents, as a family, we could afford. But my aunt and uncle had bestowed this huge blessing on me. And he was my best friend throughout my teenage years. He had a lot of tears cried into his mane. He had a lot of adventures and excitement together. And again, I had lots of family, lots of friends, a big social circle, but that was where I chose to spend my time. I would tell people, yep, I love you too, but not as much as Carlton. So I was very connected early on. And I live in an area that is close to the capital of our province. So I live in Alberta. And of course, we do have culture here and we do have some of the top universities in Canada, but ultimately we are known for ranching, agriculture, oil as well. But all of that comes with horses. So as I continued my own journey with horses and doing, I came up through Pony Club, and I would do lessons and clinics and camps. And then I wanted to focus on the jumpers. So I was able to have some really good coaches and clinicians. But I also had this exposure to a natural horsemanship way and sort of the Western world as well, because living in the capital of Alberta, we were able to draw in some really high profile clinicians. And my own county is actually the highest horse population per capita in Canada. So there's just horses everywhere. So I had the opportunity with my dad. He'd bring me to these clinics with, say, like Buck Brannaman and Josh and John Lyons and Monty Roberts and Craig Cameron, and sort of the list went on. So I would attend these clinics and audit them, and had the opportunity to participate in other types of clinics as well. And then here in Alberta, we also have Spruce Meadows. So that at the time, I think it's number 2 now, but for most of my life, it was the number 1 show jumping facility in the world. And I was exposed to those top level Olympic riders as well in the discipline of my choice at the time. So Ian Miller and Eric Lamaze, Olympians like Ludger Beerbaum, and Americans like McLean Ward and BZ Madden. And I would sit at the warm-up ring and watch and just study, and then follow them and watch what they did in those big classes. So I really had this wide exposure to horses. knowing there was something more, but still kind of focused on riding and showing. And, the relationship was very important to me, but I didn't know how important until later on. So I continued this riding and showing, and I began also to manage a warm blood breeding farm with my aunt and uncle. So I did all of the horse management. So from planning all of the breeding, selecting the breeding stock, foaling the mares, raising all the young horses, doing all the training and sales and marketing, all of those things. But really importantly, during that time, I was able to observe and learn and be mentored by all of those herd dynamics. So to just sit and watch what the mares did with their foals, to sit and watch those young bachelor herd stallions and what they did amongst each other. But the thing that really stuck out were some of these brood mares, and one in particular who was a huge mentor to me. I watched how she handled herself. It didn't matter where we put her in what herd, what group. If we sent her for breeding and she had to integrate into a population there, that mare walked in and she was the leader. It didn't matter who, what, or where, but she did it in such a confident way, a kind way. She never threw her weight around. She just walked in with respect and had respect. So I really tried to learn from those mares, and this mare in particular. During some of that time and just before, again in my teens, I had a life-altering health condition, and it made me pretty much almost non-responsive sometimes. It was very, very intense. And my mom, thank goodness for her, it led her to search out some alternative forms of healing, because I'd seen so many doctors and I'd been prescribed so many different medications. When she read the side effects, she just wasn't comfortable giving it to me. So what was interesting is that my own illness, and I'll kind of touch on it later, led more to my own spiritual connection to horses, but it also moved my mom down her own spiritual journey. So during that time of finding alternative ways to sort of heal me, she developed her own holistic healing center as a result, and eventually became a Reiki master. I, though, was very resistant. All of that was flaky to me. I wanted no part of it. I didn't understand it. I'm intrinsically kind of a logical, linear thinker. I want to know the hows and the whys. And, at that point I was like, just give me the pill. I just want the pill. And, I got to look at my own emotional well-being, or how I might have contributed to my unwellness. Like, no, I'm not playing that game at that point. But I just had so much exposure and started to have so many experiences that I couldn't refute that anymore. So it really started to begin my own journey. And all along this time, as I'm starting to come out of this and function again, I still have all of the horses in my life. I'm still exposed to their method of balance and healing and wellness that I hadn't yet fully recognized. So I also had my own daughter, my first daughter, quite young, and I didn't know what to teach her. So that pushed me along my spiritual journey as well. But all along, I'm putting my daughter on horses. We always have the horses in my life. So through my mom's holistic healing, I had exposure to every gamut. So from Reiki to acupuncture and acupressure, some shamanism, color therapy, sound therapy, essential oils, flower essences, the whole element of it, crystals, animal communications, and healings. And it led me to becoming a Reiki master myself. And my first exposure to Reiki was my mom. She sent me to a place where they worked with horses in a way that was a little bit differently. I didn't know it at the time what the difference was, but that's actually where they gave me my first level of Reiki. And at that point, I still was kind of resistant, but I thought, I've got to try something. So they attuned me to my first level of Reiki, and that opened up a whole, and it was with the horses. She is an EAL practitioner herself and offers lots of programs. And I didn't realize what that had done for me, but that really opened up a sphere of connection between the horses and I as well. when you become attuned to Reiki throughout the levels. It's sort of like attuning to, say you're on FM, but all of a sudden now you get Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and just other realms that become a little bit more accessible. So I was really on this spiritual journey myself, always with the horses by my side. But in 2012 is when it really started to come together for me. So I met my friend, Laura Hines, who'd had an exposure to this higher level of interactions that the horses will provide. And she introduced me to a special horse at that time that she'd identified as being a horse that's really drawn to interacting in this kind of particular modality of energetic exchange that provides this profound self-insight and shifts of alignment and wellness. So she brought him up, and he just started a very first session on me, and I recognized it instantly, because at this point I've now had Reiki, I've had all of this exposure to some energetic modalities. And if you've had a session with a horse where they're interacting with you intentionally, it feels very similar to a Reiki session. So it was like a light bulb went off for me, just clicked everything together. How did I not know this is what they were doing their whole life? I know horses, I know energy, and it was like a zipper. All these elements just sort of clicked all together for me. Why we feel better in their presence, why they increase self-insight and wellness and growth. Also why they can become unwell when we don't allow them to participate in their own culture, because all of this is such a part of equine culture. And then just so much more. So this really shifted me toward knowing just this soul deep and sacred purpose for myself. So I really just delved deeply, much more deeply for the next decade, just observing and allowing, and then facilitating some of these interactions with the horses for other people. And then ultimately now teaching. If you ever want to learn how something works or really understand it, try and teach it, because you have to delve so much more deeply and figure out how you're going to get the messages across. The second part that really started to pull things together for me was I had a life crisis a number of years ago, probably 4 or 5 now. And it was one of those that it was one of my worst nightmares. I did not see it coming. It absolutely took the world out from underneath my feet. And I have this one horse, and I still have blessed to have him. His name is Red. And I love them all, but there's one that I'm really connected to currently. And if I often describe him if I had a husband in the horse world, it would be Red. He's who I turn to, and he's my rock. I can turn to him forever, anything. So during this particular time, I did go to him, and he very clearly, with intention and with action, turned away and told me that I needed to stand on my own for this. And I'll tell you that, and it actually makes me emotional now, crushed me. And it brought me to my knees, quite literally at that point. But he was right. So I dug really deep. I learned, I grew stronger. I developed some new skills, some understandings, and ultimately a stronger connection to source through Red's message. So I'd always had something holding me back from really kind of diving more deeply into this purpose that I know is mine and is there, but something held me back. And I know what some of them were, but it was ultimately Red's message and that life circumstance that made me get stronger and more clear. And ultimately to where I am now and continuing to move forward in, which is with this relationship and growth and connection to spirit and all that is sacred and the ripple effect. Because ultimately one of the reasons I started some of the work that I do is because I was in an industry where I saw horses that were really unwell and unhappy and not appreciated for who they really are. So I started to think, how do I make the world better for horses? And ultimately, horses don't have horse problems. Horses have people problems. We bring them into our culture without really learning about theirs for the most part. So how do I make the world better for horses? Well, it's ultimately about making the people around them better, higher versions of their ultimate best self, because then those people interact with every other living being in a more beneficial, positive, higher level way. And then every other being that they interact with does the same. So it just ripples out. And that's really important to me in my work, this ripple effect. And there's such an interconnectedness between all living beings. So it's really, really powerful. I mentioned Tony Robbins earlier too. He has a practice that he calls priming that would be of benefit to me if I did a little more often. So I've got that in my notes to do back daily again. But he leads you through a few exercises, and one of them is gratitude, for example. But the one that sticks out to me in this conversation is he'll ask you to put yourself in a sacred moment. Really feel it, integrate it into your body, really be in that moment. And every one of them for me are with horses, every one. Specifically when we're connecting intuitively or on a higher level, a higher vibration. And very often with them working specifically on me in this modality that I've sort of touched on earlier, specifically with third eye, which is all about intuition, and crown, which is all about that connection to spirit and source and all things our spiritual nature. Or really just in training with them as they sit in their own fields and herds and hold some meditative space. That's where I feel most connected, most purposeful, myself at peace, empowered, but also very humbled. So all of that is such a spiritual element for me. And really, I wish I had known earlier the things that I know now, because I could have made life so much better for the horses that I had in my life previously. I had to have unknowingly, in ignorance and also in some arrogance, I was training them. I had to get them ready. I knew better. Shut them down and miss some of these really deep, deep connections, which ultimately, when we continue to do that, that starts to result in some dis-ease for them too. So, but clearly I didn't do that all the time, or I wouldn't have had the relationship that so many of us, do have, where we're deeply connected and have an emotional regulation ourselves and have the ability to examine ourselves. That comes from the relationship with our horses. But I could have provided just more well-being for them. I was quite moved by Fiona, whom you interviewed earlier, her story about her connection with her mare, Tiffany. And specifically what stood out for me was after Tiffany had passed, and they'd had such a, I think she said 26 years together, they were very connected and it was very long. She was able to be with her when the mare transitioned, and all quite a beautiful story, but that she had to go back to the barn with the stablemates of Tiffany. And she said she was dreading it because those three horses, Tiffany included, would always whinny to her when she pulled up. And she was dreading going because she knew she wouldn't hear Tiffany's voice when she went up that day. She had set the intention, however, that she didn't want to hear it. And she was very noticeably grateful that they didn't, the two left didn't whinny to her when she came. And then she described this beautiful interaction where the horses started to lick and nuzzle and interact with her throat. In my line of work, throat is, of course, throat chakra. And in my courses, I go through the scientific theories because I always need to know the hows and the whys about the existence of chakras and their function and how we know there's some concrete theories behind those. So throat chakra is all about communication, both outwardly and inwardly. And what had she been doing? By distance, communicating with those horses. I don't really want to hear that. So let's communicate on a different way. So there's such that element of communication in there. And she also was filled with emotion. And what do we feel when we're holding emotion back? That lump in your throat. So the horse is moving blockages, releasing energy, but also increasing that higher level of communication. She also mentioned there's some interaction with her head. So crown and a higher level of spiritual connection, which is all about communication as well. What really stood out though too is she described that feeling of bliss, which I hear from my clients a lot. They'll leave in a state of euphoria after these interactions, but when she left, she expected to feel that despair and the grief again, but she felt like it was lifted and it shifted. And again, that's what horses will help do, help us release it, help it be grounded, complete a circuit, and be moved out of us in the ways that are best and most beneficial for us. So that really stood out for me, because that's horse culture. That's what horses do amongst each other. That's why being in a herd is so important for horses, to balance each other. As horse people, we often talk about mutual grooming, but when you really start to observe and pay attention, you will notice that they interact with each other in specific areas, and most often they correlate to an energy center or a chakra. And as we start to know what those chakras are, we start to build a picture of what's going on for those horses, the people around them. And they will offer the same to people when we are open, when we have an awareness, when we allow this. And it's incredibly, incredibly powerful for us all. So that horse culture element is one of the ways that I can share some information with people that help them also connect on a higher level that is spiritual ultimately for many people. I have a story of a previous client who came out about 8 years ago. He is an Indigenous person who does a lot of healing work with horses in his own community. But he came out for an interaction for himself. And he wrote a testimony for me and sort of describes how it all went and how he was feeling. And the horse interacted on a number of areas for him that he wasn't quite sure he understood until we facilitated and shared some information. So he had the interaction and was grateful for it, and he went home. And then he sent me a message saying, I'm a smoker, and I left your place, and a day and a half later, I haven't had a cigarette. I used to smoke, I think he said, like a pack a day. And he said, I have no interest in smoking. I don't want it at all. And 8 years later, he's still a non-smoker. And he attributes that to that specific interaction with this horse, because ultimately he's a healer. He knows within himself that smoking is not healthy for him. He didn't have a conscious intention, but the horses will help bring subconscious to a conscious awareness. They also perceive things that aren't coherent for us. Are we out of coherence ourselves? Are we presenting one way on the outside, but internally we actually are another? So, there's just sort of story after story of the horses helping to create these shifts in people. And that is, again, part of the ripple effect. And that fills the soul deep sacred purpose within me, the connection with my horses that is so beneficial for me in terms of providing an energetic exchange where we really are becoming aligned, but also the self-insight. Well, why is my horse interacting with my chest all the time? What is there? What does that mean? What can I shift or have an awareness around? How do I learn and grow? To being able to do the same for clients or family or friends and people around us. And it is that connection with the horses that fulfills a spiritual connection for me. So there's a little bit of a long-winded response to how do I connect with them spiritually?
Well, it was a great response. I've actually forgotten if I'm supposed to even add anything after listening to that. It's interesting, Chant, my bay mare, when she came to me, she had a pole injury, and nobody really knows what happened to her because of where she came from. But she did a lot of head flipping and all that. And now I find that she will frequently bonk me in the head, usually with the underside of her head, her jaw. Like she meets me at the gate and I'll reach over to get the halter and or take the fly mask off, and she'll kind of bonk me on the head. And I just look at her and, can you not see that I'm here? So now after hearing this, I'm going to pay a little bit more attention and do a little bit more introspective meditating on my own self about this, because I know she can see me. I mean, horses, she knows exactly, but she frequently does bonk me on top of the head.
Yeah.
So now I'm feeling very chagrined about this whole thing. It's like, oh, I wasn't aware.
Well, isn't that amazing? It's just a shift in awareness, and then all of a sudden things start to become clearer and more
Of
clear.
course.
It's also when you learn more, you realize how much more there is to learn, which is just a learning growth experience all the way throughout life. The more I learn, the more I know how much more I need to be learning.
Right. The more I know, the more I know, I less than I know.
That's right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, now I have to regroup and get back into conversation mode here. What are your thoughts on, I know a lot of people think that horses come in and they're just automatically so much more enlightened than humans. My experience is that we're kind of all the same. Some of us come in with this more of a purpose, that we're going to be more spiritually inclined, or we're going to focus on our evolution as beings on the planet together. And others seem to be a little bit more oblivious. What are your thoughts on that with horses? Do you think, just what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So my observations so far have been that horses do connect much more easily. They're not as attached to their physical form as humans typically are. You know, they transition much more easily. They spend more time connecting on an energetic level. They're nonverbal. They use their intuitive senses and their, heightened bioreceptors within their five senses, of course, but they stay very connected. So my experience is they're always a little bit more on a higher level intrinsically. Now that can change depending on their experiences throughout life. They might have to shut some of that off in order to survive in the human world. Think about those busy show barns. And it's also, my perception is every person and every horse, ultimately every human or every living being, is able to connect on a higher level, is able to connect intuitively, remotely, all of those things. But some of us just are more drawn to it than others. Some people might choose to be, let's say, a doctor or a lawyer, and others might choose to be like a Reiki master or an energy healer. Some of us are just a little more drawn, and I find that in horses for sure. There are often horses, all horses can do this type of work, but some of them are more called to it a little than others. And often what we'll see is horses that, let's just talk about mutual grooming again for just a second. Who's that itchy at the same time in the same place? So when we just start to look a little more deeply and recognize what balancing they're doing on each other and why and those sorts of things, my observation has been that a lot of times those horses that interact with the mutual, and I call it mutual balancing, more than others, are often the ones that will offer to interact with people in a similar way more than others. So do I feel like they're all, I don't know if you use the word enlightened. I feel like intrinsically they are more tuned in than we are right off the bat, and that can shift throughout their life depending on their experiences. But that, like people, some are more drawn to interacting than others. And I've also found that a lot of the ones that have either shut down or haven't sort of explored that area of themselves, you can encourage that. I've had horses be very shut down that didn't want to interact, that are now some of my most reliable horses that I know will come and offer to people. So again, like people, a lot of it is a muscle. Intuition is just a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Right.
The same with intention. So I have found horses to be similar without making them, putting human attributes on them. They are horses first and foremost, but we have some similarities. It's been my experience.
Okay, so another question that just popped up when you were talking is, do you think that horses teach other horses? Do you think that horses themselves have spiritual mentors?
Absolutely. Yes. So I've done a lot of herd observation, sort of from a physical level. Okay, who's the lead mare, who's the stallion, where's the subordinates, all of those sorts of things that we know maybe from a more behavior perspective. But I've also really studied them from an energetic level. And yes, we'll still see a leader, the herd leader. We'll see sentries, we'll see balancers. Those are ones that I often see mutually balancing more than others because they're invested in creating balance within the herd. Because ultimately horses they're prey animals and they're herd animals. So their safety is in numbers. And one of their top priorities, again, is staying safe. So the more balanced and connected they are as a herd, the safer they are. When there's discord or an unwell horse, you're drawing predators. So it really is horse culture to work together and ensure that they're all balanced and connected to their environment, to their herd, and within themselves. So we'll see those balancers, but I absolutely have seen instances of mentors and mentorees. So just as an example, I have a lead gelding here. And for a long time, I had about 20 horses in our herd here. And he was the herd leader of everybody. And we had a young horse coming up that I could see him mentoring, not only to be an eventual leader, but that horse is, the leader, his name is Ben, mentored this young horse to be the physical leader, but Ben is also one of the main balancers in our field. He perceives his job to be really keeping all of the other horses in balance. So he mentored that young horse in both roles. And I really saw the young horse step up in his balancing role as well. So absolutely, I have seen indications of that.
Interesting. I often look between my horses and they're so different. Chant is loud and wants her opportunity and is very important. She has a lot of confidence and a lot of beliefs in herself. And my gray mare, Mystic, is very subtle, very recessive, and very accepting. And I try to look at how they work their spiritual journey. And because they're opposites, I can see where they would actually have a lot to share each other. But I haven't really figured out exactly how that is. And I would love to find out more about how is it that Mystic, teaches Chant about being a little bit more receptive, and how is it that Chant teaches Mystic about having more value. And
I could give you one little tip as you're observing them. Would we'll start very simply. Watch, do they work on each other? Like, do they mutually groom?
Not much.
Okay.
Not much.
So I have a technique, and after this, I can send it to you. It's the surge technique that you actually can start to initiate that between two horses. And it's something that mares do with their own foals right off the bat. And then the horses carry on. So it's something they recognize very quickly. And so you can initiate them starting to work together, first of all. And then as they work together, watch where on their bodies they interact. So a lot of horses, for example, if there's a horse that needs a little more self-confidence, so their sense of self is a little depleted, maybe they've come out of a state of trauma, something like that, you'll often see another horse work on solar plexus for them. So that's sort of mid back-ish on a horse. Solar plexus is all about your sense of self, your personal power, self-discipline, those sorts of things, really to stand in your own power. So we'll see another horse help that type of horse by working on them in that area. So if you can get them kind of working together a little bit, you will start to see that they're intentional and specific about where they apply their energy to another horse's body.
Interesting. I will look at that, and I'll look for your
Yes, I'll make a
document
note
that you
to send
send
it
me.
to you.
Okay, well, then there was a lot of really good and heartfelt information in this conversation. I so appreciate it. Would you like to take a couple of minutes and talk about your business and let people know how they can get a hold of you?
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. So the biggest part of my business that I'm focusing on right now is I have a few online programs, and my signature course is called Equus Empowered. It is a 9-week program. So there's 9 modules. And we go through a lot of what we've talked about today in terms of horse culture, learning a little bit more about their behaviors, how to develop this more deeply connected relationship, really to understand their communications, their behaviors, and connecting on more of an intuitive level, really starting to trust your intuitive senses. Horses do that all the time. It comes from the teachings of from horse culture, and then why the access to horse culture is so important to equine well-being, and then how does their well-being relate to ours, and their ability to offer the same to our clients. So it's about building relationship and also how you apply that to your business. So if you're an equine professional, how to incorporate this type of modality into your already running programs. And then I also give you some options for some standalone ones. So just to kind of build up some of your own offerings. So over that 9 weeks, there's 9 modules, and you have access to all the theory and example on video. And then you'll have some integrative practices, so some homework. You go out and do practice what we've learned in that particular module with your own horses. And then you fill out a worksheet just to really kind of integrate it and incorporate it, put some words to what your experience was. And then at the end of each week, we have a Zoom meeting with a small group of like-minded, really supportive other people who are going through the program. And they create some pretty lasting bonds within those groups. The benefit to that is then we're discussing the content, we're discussing your specific interactions and questions with your horses, your clients, that sort of thing. Your family and friends, it doesn't have to be a client either. A lot of us want to share our horses and our interactions with our family and our friends, part of the ripple effect. And then there's a little element of accountability in there, because a lot of people, it's hard to make the time to do some of this. So when you know that you're going to have a Zoom meeting where we're all going to chat and learn and grow together, you make the time to go out and do those interactions. And ultimately, that's what builds your relationship and your communication and your understanding, and ultimately your partnership with your horses too. So I always offer just a free connection call. As I mentioned, contribution is a big driving force for me. So there's never any expectations. I'm just always happy to connect with people and offer some value if I can. For example, I'll send you a surge resource. That's what I do for other people as well. Sort of find out where they're at right now and where they'd like to be, and if the course is of service to them. And if it is, wonderful. If it's not, no problem. I just would like to offer some connection and value anyway. So the best way to get a hold of me, if anyone was interested in that, is to go to my website, which I think you said you would put down below, is www.leahdyck, so DYCK.com. And there's information there, and my contact information is there as well. I do have a Facebook page. My social media is not quite up to par, but I'm working on that. But you can find me at Leah Dyck Equus Attuned. So my business name is Equus Attuned, and the course that I'm speaking about now is Equus Empowered.
Okay, and I will put those in the notes on the YouTube link that this will be published on. So Leah, thank you so much for your time and your insight. It's been great talking to you, and I will go ahead and we're going to stop this recording here pretty soon, but I just wanted to say thanks for joining us. I'm Leah with True North Equestrians, and my website is truenorthequestrians.com. There's other conversations that are also posted on the videos link there, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next interview.